Andre the Giant is a legend. We've seen his face on TV, in the film The Princess Bride, on posters. He was a very large man and one of the most recognized faces around the world. There was a lot more to this man, though, than just his size. Here are a few facts about the legendary Andre the Giant that you might not know. Andre the Giant was a simple country boy, but his childhood was not carefree. It was hard to be so much bigger than everyone around him. Fortunately, despite being encased in a huge body, Andre managed to overcome obstacles in life and rose to glory and victory. Andre took something that would tear most people down, and it made him stronger. Andre was born May 19, 1946, to an immigrant family in the agrarian village Moulins in France. He was born André René Roussimoff, and at birth he weighed a whopping 11 pounds. Fortunately, despite being such a large baby, André was in perfect health when he was born and showed no signs of any medical problems. Growing up in the country, his family gave him the nickname Didi. André's family home was around 30 miles from Paris, but the big city was far from his mind. He loved living on a farm, and as a child he never could have imagined that he would be living an entirely different life as an adult. André's parents, Boris and Marianne Roussimoff, were both average in size. André inherited his height from his grandfather, who was Bulgarian. His grandfather was 7 feet 8 inches tall. That's even taller than André grew to be. André had a growth spurt in his teens, and his family realized he'd be the only family member to be so tall since André's siblings were all average size and showed no signs of gigantism. André was sure that he was going to be a farmer like his father, so he dropped out of school in the 8th grade. His family was upset by this because they knew education was important. Fortunately, Nobel Prize winner Samuel Beckett stepped in to help. Samuel just happened to be a friend of André's father, and he helped André understand that having an education was important, no matter what career you choose. Each day, the Nobel Prize winner would pick André and his siblings up for school and drive them in his flatbed pickup truck. In school, André excelled in mathematics. From an early age, André's size became a problem. His fingers were so big he couldn't dial the phone. He had to use a pencil. That was frustrating for the young man, but at least he found a way around it. André loved music, but he never could play an instrument. He tried to play the guitar and the piano, but again, his giant fingers made that impossible. After graduating from high school, André hoped to join the French army. You'd think that he'd be a great addition to the army because of his size. The enemy would likely be terrified of the giant soldier during hand-to-hand combat. Unfortunately, things did not work out for André the way that he had hoped. He wasn't able to join the French army because they didn't have uniforms large enough to fit him. Also, the military beds in the barracks were too small to fit André's massive body. Again, one of his dreams had failed. Due to his size, he couldn't become a musician or a soldier. This would have torn a lot of people down, but not André. He wasn't going to give up. He was sure he would find his niche in life. André's size may have limited his choices in life, but in sports, his size was a blessing. André was a great rugby player, and he was also pretty good at soccer. When André was at the gym, his friend told him that he knew that a member of the wrestling team was injured and needed to be temporarily replaced. The friend suggested that André could be a great substitute. Before that point, André never even thought about wrestling. He liked to try new things, though, so he decided to go for it. He had no idea at the time it would be one of the best decisions of his life. To be a wrestler, he had to move to Paris to get training that he needed to excel at the sport. At the time, André was working as a mover. He spent his days working and then spent his nights training to be a wrestler. He was really excelling, but something shocking happened when he returned home to visit his parents. He had changed so much, his parents didn't recognize him. By the time André was 20 years old, he had become an incredible wrestler. His decision to start training turned out to be more of an opportunity than he thought it would be. While wrestling in Paris, he met a promoter named Frank Valois. Frank was impressed by André's size and strength, and he offered to take André to Canada to help him become a professional wrestler. Frank was a great manager, and he was booking André for wrestling events all around the world. André made appearances in England, Germany, Japan, and Australia. Growing up on a farm, André never expected that he'd be traveling the world. Finally, André saw that his size was a blessing, not a curse. André's first wrestling name was Jean Ferre. He was incredibly popular in Japan and had a huge fan following there. To please his fans in Japan, he visited the country, and despite his fame and fortune that his size brought him, he realized he was still too big to fit in a small world. While in Japan, his size was a big problem. Everything in the country was just too small. He couldn't fit properly in the beds. Even the bathrooms were too small for his giant size. His visit to Japan showed him that he couldn't escape the daily challenges that his size created. He knew that he was a giant, but he had no idea what was causing his giant size. Andre's colossal size was gaining him fans from all around the world. Because his grandfather was so tall, Andre just assumed that his giant size was genetic. While visiting Japan in 1970, Andre found out the real reason that he was so large. The doctors told him he was suffering from acromegaly. The doctors told him that he had a tumor in his brain which causes a massive increase in growth hormones, and that's what caused his giant size. And if that's not enough, the doctors told Andre that there was a good chance that he would not live past the age of 40. That news was distressing, but Andre wasn't going to let it define his life. He decided that even if he was destined to have a shorter life than most, he was going to do his best to achieve his goals of glory while he still had a chance. Andre didn't let his brain tumor get him down, and he continued to pursue his career in wrestling. His fan base was growing every day, and he was selling out stadiums all over the world. People were fascinated with his size. He never met an opponent he couldn't beat until 1971. Andre got into the ring with an Iraqi wrestler named Adnan Al-Qasi. This was the match that Andre ended up losing. People couldn't believe that Andre was beaten by a man who was so much smaller than him. Suddenly, people realized maybe this giant wasn't invincible. The fans were sure that it was humiliating for Andre, but they had no idea that somebody was watching who had a very different perspective about him. There was one man following Andre's career who was huge in the wrestling world: Vince McMahon. He was the owner of the biggest wrestling franchise in the world, the WWF, today known as the WWE. Vince McMahon had been watching Andre and offered to sponsor him. The only catch was that Andre had to allow Vince to rebrand him. The image that Vince wanted Andre to portray was that of a monstrous, hulking beast rather than an agile gymnast in the wrestling ring. Part of the rebranding would be to change Andre's name. Vince suggested that Andre change his name from Jean Ferre to Andre the Giant. Thanks to Vince McMahon and his rebranding, Andre was now well known all over every continent. He grew his hair long and was finally happy about his humongous stature. He was an actual celebrity now. Thanks to Vince McMahon, he was a worldwide sensation. From the time of Andre's debut and for the next 15 years, he went undefeated. For 15 years in the World Wrestling Federation, he was an undefeated champion. He was the Goliath of the wrestling world, and there was no David around to defeat him. He overwhelmed most of his opponents, and fans came out in droves to watch the giant wrestler. They were tuning in on TV every week to see if anybody could step in the ring and defeat Andre the Giant. Opponents came from all over to see if the myth of the man was real. They wanted to see in person if there was a man of such monumental proportions. It wasn't just Andre's size that made his fans root for him. It was also his charisma that made people love him. Andre the Giant was the whole package, and he was undefeated in the ring. With WWF Wrestling being broadcast on cable TV, the wrestlers of the organization were becoming more and more famous. One of the top wrestlers on the bill was Hulk Hogan. He was 6 feet 7 inches tall, and he was a wrestling machine. On screen, Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant were bitter rivals, but off-screen, the men were best friends. Over the years, they wrestled one another, switching roles from time to time as heroes and villains. The men's on-screen animosity was soon to see its culmination in one of the biggest wrestling matches in history, Wrestlemania. It was the biggest wrestling event of the year. It was a live, indoor stadium event, and it still takes place every year today. The two went head-to-head at Wrestlemania 3. It took place in 1997 at the Pontiac Silverdome. In the stadium were 93,000 fans watching. There were also millions watching from home. During the event, Andre was portrayed as a bully who ripped apart Hulk Hogan's shirt. After being manhandled for a large part of the match, Hulk Hogan defeated Andre the Giant. He was the new champion, ending Andre's streak of 15 years. After the competition, Andre and Hulk went out to celebrate with a few beers. Given his size, it's said that Andre could consume more alcohol than most men. Hulk Hogan says he never saw Andre drink less than 24 beers in a single sitting. Other colleagues say that he never drank less than 100 beers in one drinking session, which sounds like a bit of an exaggeration, but the most amount of beer he ever was seen consuming is 156 beers. Andre was a legendary drinker as well as a wrestler, and will not soon be forgotten. Subscribe for more.